Three facts can be true at the same time. Greenland matters strategically. NATO is built on trust, and words from a U.S. president can create operational risk long before any order is signed. Over the past days, President Trump's rhetoric about U.S. control of Greenland has intensified public anxiety across allied capitals, and it has forced a question that militaries normally avoid discussing out loud. What if political talk collides with alliance obligations and the laws of armed conflict? This is not a partisan argument about style. It is an institutional question about command authority, constitutional limits, and the moral burden placed on service members. If you want to understand why national security professionals are alarmed, stay with me. Because the real story is how quickly a hypothetical can become a planning requirement and how expensive that becomes for credibility. A NATO ally being treated as a hypothetical adversary is not a normal policy dispute. It is a structural shock to the alliance system. When President Trump speaks in maximal terms about territorial control, allied governments cannot treat that as mere theater, because defense planning is a profession built on worst-case preparation. The moment uncertainty enters the picture, staff officers begin asking procedural questions. What authorities would be claimed? What legal opinions would be demanded? What rules of engagement could even be written? And what would the alliance response look like if Denmark invoked collective consultations? A responsible analysis starts here, even if no action follows, forcing allies and commanders to model these scenarios. Damages trust, and trust is a hard currency in deterrence. The public tends to focus on politics. Professionals focus on the planning signal. Greenland's legal status matters because it changes the frame from geography to alliance commitments. Greenland is not an unclaimed space. It is an autonomous territory within the Kingdom of Denmark, and Denmark is a NATO member. That means any discussion that resembles coercion toward Greenland quickly becomes discussion about Denmark's sovereignty and NATO's political cohesion. In practical terms, NATO does not need a shooting war to suffer damage. It needs only persistent doubt about whether Article 5 solidarity is reliable and whether U.S. power will be used to protect allies or pressure them. President Trump may argue he is pursuing national security. Critics argue he is testing boundaries. The institutional impact is the same: uncertainty spreads, and uncertainty invites miscalculation. The military's dilemma begins with the oath, not with politics. U.S. service members swear to support and defend the Constitution, and that oath is operationalized through lawful orders. When analysts warn that a hypothetical operation against Allied territory would be illegal, the correct way to say it professionally is that it would trigger immediate legal scrutiny under domestic authorities, international law principles, and the laws of armed conflict, as well as intense consultation with civilian leadership in Congress. The point is not to dramatize refusal. The point is to explain what responsible militaries do when legality is unclear. They ask, document, elevate, and insist on counsel. Trump's rhetoric matters because it can push these questions from academic seminars into real-world decision cycles. And once a decision cycle begins, reputations and careers can be forced into impossible corners. The question most viewers will not ask, but every commander will, is simple. What happens to a force designed for collective defense if it is asked to rehearse the opposite mission? Here's the reality: decades of interoperability. Joint exercises, shared communications, and mutual trust are not plug-and-play. They are relationships built through repetition. When senior professionals describe the idea of turning those relationships backward, they are describing a psychological and operational injury to the institution. Trump does not have to issue an order to cause this injury. He only has to make the scenario plausible enough that planning begins. That is why allies react so sharply to language. It is not sensitivity, it is risk management. From a European perspective, the issue is not only what Trump wants, it is what precedent he signals. If economic pressure, diplomatic intimidation, or implied force becomes normalized between allies, then smaller states must assume they are negotiable objects rather than sovereign partners. That assumption reshapes everything: defense posture, political alignment, procurement, choices, and public opinion. In alliance politics, public opinion is not decoration, it is legitimacy. When citizens in allied countries begin to fear the United States rather than trust it, leaders have less room to cooperate even when shared interests remain. Trump's defenders might say this is tough bargaining. But bargaining among allies relies on consent, not fear. And once fear enters, the alliance becomes brittle. It is also important to separate two different conversations that often get merged: Arctic security cooperation and territorial control. The United States already has legitimate security interests in the Arctic, including early warning maritime routes and strategic competition. Those interests can be pursued through basing agreements, infrastructure, joint exercises, intelligence sharing, and investment in capabilities tools that strengthen alliance legitimacy. Territorial control is different. It introduces sovereignty conflict, which is uniquely destabilizing inside NATO. If Trump frames Greenland as essential to a missile defense architecture, The responsible approach is to ask what access and cooperation are required and whether those can be achieved through treaty-based mechanisms rather than coercive framing. The tool choice determines whether the policy reinforces the alliance or fractures it. Inside the U.S. system, Congress is the quiet center of gravity that the public often forgets. War powers, appropriations, oversight hearings, and statutory limits are not procedural trivia. They are the constitutional design for preventing unilateral escalation. When members of Congress publicly warn that military action would require congressional approval, they are not merely signaling politics, they are signaling institutional friction that would slow, constrain, and expose decision-making to scrutiny. That friction matters to the Pentagon because it clarifies legitimacy. It matters to allies because it signals that the U.S. has internal brakes. Trump's posture challenges those brakes by testing whether norms hold under pressure. The country's stability depends on whether institutions respond with clarity rather than silence. The chain of command issue is not only legal, it is moral injury risk. Militaries teach loyalty, discipline, and restraint, but they also teach a professional ethic: do not treat partners as targets without lawful cause. If rhetoric implies that allied territory is negotiable, service members can begin to feel that their years of partnership were instrumental rather than principled. That feeling corrodes cohesion. Trump's critics describe this as betrayal. Supporters may see it as strategic repositioning. My professional view is that cohesion is not a slogan. It is the difference between a disciplined force and a confused one. And confusion is where accidents happen, especially in the Arctic, where distances are vast and communications are imperfect. If you think this is only about Denmark and Greenland, consider the second-order effect every other ally starts asking whether they could be next. That is how alliance anxiety spreads. The practical response is hedging, alternative suppliers, alternative basing options, alternative diplomatic coalitions, and louder public distance from Washington. Trump may believe pressure produces compliance. But in alliance politics, pressure often produces diversification. Diversification is not a headline, it is a slow, structural drift. And once allies build alternatives, they do not unbuild them quickly. The real cost is not tomorrow. The real cost is what America loses 5 years from now in influence it assumed was permanent. The international law dimension is often oversimplified on television, so let's be careful. The UN Charter framework, sovereignty norms, and customary principles create strong presumptions against the use of force except in self-defense or under recognized legal authorization. Allies do not need to agree on every interpretation to recognize the political reality. Using force against allied associated territory would generate immediate global condemnation, trigger NATO crisis mechanisms, and likely fracture the alliance's legal and moral foundation. That is why even discussing the scenario carries gravity. Trump can insist he is negotiating. But if the negotiation posture relies on implied force, it collides with the architecture that has kept the North Atlantic relatively stable for decades. Now place yourself in the position of senior U.S. commanders. They are trained to avoid politics, but they are also trained to think in scenarios. When a president repeatedly uses language that keeps military options open, the military's professional reflex is to ask what it would take to execute, what it would break, and what it would cost. That does not mean they want it, it means they are responsible for readiness. This is the unthinkable position that commentators are describing. Preparation becomes indistinguishable from endorsement in the public mind, even when it is merely contingency planning. Trump's rhetoric therefore creates a reputational trap for the armed forces. It forces them to either speak, which they rarely do, or plan quietly, which looks like acquiescence. There is a domestic civil-military norm at stake here, the expectation that the military is not a personal instrument of a leader's ambition, but an institution bound by law, policy, and national interest. When public debate frames this as a test of whether officers will obey any order, it misunderstands how lawful command works. Lawful command is not unlimited command. Officers are expected to seek clarity when orders conflict with law, standing rules, or established authorities. The true stabilizer is not a dramatic act of refusal. It is the boring, procedural insistence on legality, documentation, and civilian oversight. Trump's governing style, often described as improvisational, collides with a system designed to slow improvisation on matters of war. Allies also read American silence as signal. When retired officials speak and active duty leaders remain quiet, that is normal in a healthy democracy, but it can still create misinterpretation abroad. European defense planners might conclude the United States is drifting toward a more transactional view of alliance commitments, where protection is conditional, and pressure is a tool even among partners. Trump's defenders will say that is simply realism. Yet realism without guardrails becomes opportunism, and opportunism erodes deterrence. Deterrence works when allies believe the U.S. is predictable in defense of shared territory. The moment that predictability fades, adversaries test seams. And seams are where crises begin. Here's the turning point that matters most: the moment the alliance stops debating policy and starts debating intent. Once allies believe intent is coercive, every concession looks like surrender and every compromise looks dangerous. That is why rhetoric hardens positions. Trump may want leverage, but leverage that looks like coercion changes the negotiation game. It removes the middle ground, and it increases the chance that some actor somewhere misreads a signal and overreacts. The Arctic is not forgiving. Small misreadings become big incidents. This is why professionals plead for disciplined language, not because they fear debate, but because they fear miscalculation. Let's address the practical NATO mechanism without melodrama. If Denmark believed its territory or territorial integrity was threatened, it would seek consultations under NATO procedures. Those consultations are political, not automatic war triggers, but they create immediate alliance-wide urgency. They also pull in the European Union's economic and political tools, meaning the response would not be purely military. That layered response matters because it means Trump's posture, if sustained, invites a combined pressure environment, diplomatic isolation, economic retaliation, and institutional backlash. Even if the White House never intends force, the mere plausibility can produce these consequences. In modern geopolitics, perception can become policy. A responsible viewer should separate three categories that get blended online. First, confirmed actions and formal orders which are documented and traceable. Second, reported remarks and public statements which can be quoted and evaluated but do not by themselves constitute operational directives. Third, speculation about what might happen, which can be useful for risk assessment but becomes misinformation when presented as certainty. Right now, much of the public discourse about Trump and Greenland lives in the second and third categories. That matters because viral claims can pressure institutions to react to rumors rather than to policy. The correct standard is simple: treat hypothetical scenarios as hypothetical while still taking rhetoric seriously as a strategic signal. Can you see the difference between preparing for a risk and declaring the risk inevitable? The strategic cost to the United States is credibility, and credibility is not abstract. It affects basing rights, overflight permissions, intelligence sharing, and the willingness of allies to align with U.S. priorities in other theaters. If European partners begin to view the Trump administration as willing to trade alliance norms for short-term leverage, they will become more cautious across the board. That means slower cooperation on Russia, on China, on Arctic surveillance, and on sanctions enforcement. In other words, Trump could weaken the very security goals he claims to advance not through defeat but through distrust. In national security, distrust is a friction multiplier. It makes every operation harder. There is also a human cost that rarely makes headlines: the burden on families in uniform. Service members and spouses build their lives around a moral narrative of service, defending the country, honoring alliances, protecting shared values. When political rhetoric threatens to invert that narrative, it creates anxiety that the institution cannot easily counsel away. Leaders can brief strategy, but they cannot erase the feeling of betrayal if troops believe they might be asked to harm those they train beside. Trump may dismiss this as sensitivity, but militaries are made of humans, and morale is a strategic asset. When morale fractures, readiness follows. Before we close, there's one more layer that changes the stakes: how adversaries exploit allied division. When allies argue publicly, opponents do not need to create chaos. They only need to amplify it. If Russia or other rivals can persuade European publics that America under Trump is unreliable, they win strategic space without firing a shot. That is why the Greenland rhetoric is not a sideshow. It becomes a vulnerability in information warfare and diplomatic maneuvering, and it places U.S. military personnel in a paradox. They become both the symbol of American commitment and the potential instrument of American unpredictability. No professional force wants to carry that contradiction. My personal assessment is not that war is inevitable, but that institutional damage is already measurable when allies are forced into contingency planning against each other. Presidents come and go, but alliance architecture is slow to rebuild once trust is broken. If President Trump truly believes Greenland is vital to U.S. security, the most durable path is treaty-based cooperation and shared investment, not maximalist rhetoric that turns partners into hostages of American domestic politics. Strength is not only the ability to coerce. In a rules-based order, strength is the ability to persuade allies that your power is predictable and your commitments are stable. Right now, the worry in allied capitals is not America's capacity, it is America's intent. The Greenland controversy, as President Trump frames it, is forcing a serious national conversation that Americans usually postpone until a crisis: who controls escalation, what limits constrain executive power, and what we owe the allies who stood with us in our hardest moments. The U.S. military should never be used as a tool to experiment with alliance boundaries because the price is paid in credibility, morale, and long-term security cooperation. We do not yet know how this will resolve, and responsible analysis should avoid absolute predictions. But we do know what the precedent would teach if rhetoric becomes policy, alliances are conditional, and trust is disposable. If you want careful, legally grounded coverage of what comes next, what Congress does, what NATO signals, and how the Pentagon navigates lawful command, follow this channel, subscribe, and turn on notifications. And leave me one serious question. In a democracy, what is the safest way to ensure national security goals never outrun the constitutional restraints designed to keep us stable?